We had the opportunity last week to sit down with Dr. Ernst Root. He's an Afrikaner activist, author, and filmmaker from South Africa to discuss exactly what's going on in South Africa, which should terrify anyone who believes in equal protection of the laws. Here's what it sounded like. Dr. Roots, thanks so much for stopping by. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
So for our listeners who are not familiar with South Africa, they might be seeing a tweet from President Trump here or a tweet from Elon Musk, but they don't actually know the roots of South African history. And so they look at the racial issues that have arrived there, and they have sort of a left-wing view that's been drilled into them that essentially this is just a matter of decolonization, colonialism. Why don't we go back to the beginning? What are Afrikaners doing in South Africa?
Well, thank you, Ben, for having me on the show. So the Afrikaners' history in South Africa goes back to 1652, which is before the Declaration of Independence. So we've been there for hundreds of years, almost 400 years. It started initially as a settlement or a refreshment station in the Cape, where Cape Town is today. And eventually they were joined by other groups coming in from Europe, French, Germans, and then in smaller numbers, initially some other groups as well. Later, the English came, so we have a big white Anglo community in South Africa. And we've been there for hundreds of years. We're not Dutch anymore. We have developed our own culture. We have our own language. We named ourselves after the continent. We are the Afrikaners. Our language is Afrikaans. And we have our own literature, our own poetry, our own philosophy. We have all these things that we have had again, developed for hundreds of years. And over time, obviously, in any country like this, our history is very similar to the American story in a sense. Also with the pioneers, the great track that we had into the interior. In America, you had the track to the west. So, and there's in a story like this, there's always friction, and it's almost like news. People like to focus on the friction and ignore the cooperation. But there were incredible stories of cooperation between communities in South Africa. But when you talk about history in South Africa now, you're only allowed to talk about the friction, when the truth is that we've had a long history of cooperating with communities and so forth. And yes, one thing led to another. The Cape was colonized around the time of the Napoleonic Wars by the British. We then moved in towards the interior. We had some battles, we had some treaties, we bought land. There were some areas that weren't settled. You're not allowed to say that, but South Africa wasn't densely populated back then. We started the Boer republics, the Transvaal and the Free State, which led to the Anglo-Boer War after gold and diamonds were discovered. After which South Africa became a union in 1910, which means all the republics, the kingdoms of the African tribes and so forth, the colonies, everything was combined into one big whole, which became South Africa. And then, of course, we had the apartheid history, and this is sort of a very quick overview, leading to the negotiated settlement in 1994, which led to this new South Africa, which was celebrated all over the world as a miracle, and it was sort of the shining example of what the United Nations can do to save a country. And the Constitution was celebrated, and now we are here, where it turns out that story, this miracle story, was not as shining as people would have liked it to be.
And I think it's that part that is puzzling to people, because they've been taught the miracle story. They've seen the movies about Nelson Mandela. They've seen the films and TV shows about the great moment when apartheid ended. And there's sort of been a ban publicly on talking about the problems that exist in South Africa post that, because to mention that there are some fairly significant problems, as it turns out, in post-apartheid South Africa is seen as some sort of endorsement of apartheid itself, which is a false binary.
Yeah, exactly. So that's the problem that we have, is we have this narrative that you can choose between the apartheid system and the current system. And there's only those two options. You have nothing else to choose from. And so you have to choose what's currently happening in South Africa. And if you don't choose that, or if you say this is a problem, that by definition means you want to go back. You want to go to the apartheid system, which no one wants to do. The fact is that the apartheid system didn't work. The current system isn't working, and we need something else. We need a better system. But we are very happy that a lot of people are taking note about what's happening in South Africa, because this has been going on for decades. And I think the pendulum has swung so far to the one side, or to the left, you could say, that it's the narrative about South Africa has become so detached from the realities on ground level that it's just not possible to ignore what's happening in South Africa. And so we are grateful that people are talking about this, and people should be talking about it more.
So let's talk about the history of South Africa since the end of apartheid. Again, that's where most people's story ends, is end of apartheid, happily ever after. What has actually happened? What were the political transformations that took place in South Africa after the settlement of 94?
Well, one way I think to understand what's happening is the negotiations for the new South Africa started immediately after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And that was, the end of history era. And there was a sort of a narrative that capitalism and liberalism has won, and it's going to be the standard, the gold standard all over the world eventually. And we need to write a constitution for South Africa along these lines. And the problem with that in South Africa is that it's a very big country. It's very diverse. It's more like Europe than like the US in a certain sense. It's almost as big as Western Europe, at least. And it's many diverse nations and peoples living there. And so the ruling party, the ANC, back then they said, the way we're going to do this is we want what they call a national democratic revolution. And that essentially means using democracy as a way to promote socialist ideals. And the way they did that, they said it's going to be a two-phase revolution. Phase one is present ourselves as very liberal, very open-minded, very pro-democracy to get more and more support in South Africa and all over the world, and which worked obviously brilliantly. And then the theory or the strategy that they wrote it out, it's all on paper. They said that once we have the power, or the levers of power, as they put it, then we should eventually move to the second phase of the revolution. And that means using the state mechanisms to become much more aggressive in implementing socialist policies. And so the first big one was 1996 with in America you call it DEI, we call it BEE, which is Black Economic Empowerment, but it has nothing to do with empowerment. It's handing out social grants, and it's discriminating against people who aren't Black. So they started with that in 1996, which became more and more aggressive over time, up to the point where there are now more than 140 race laws in South Africa today. So that was one strand. Another strand was the property rights thing, where they said in 2018, we're going to start a process to change the property rights clause in the Constitution so that the state can expropriate private property without compensation, which is just confiscation of property. So that's another strand. And then there's also the strand of the hate speech and real hate speech. I mean, actually targeting a group of people, identifying them based on their ethnicity, and then saying, we need to go out and kill those people. It's not offensive speech. It's calling for the Boers to be slaughtered. And that's combined with political speeches, with statements such as, and this is a direct quote, all white people are criminals and they should be treated as such. And then these politicians would burst out chanting, kill the Boer, kill the farmer. And the Boer is, of course, a reference to the Afrikaner people. And this has been getting worse and worse and worse, up to the point where, again, as I said, you cannot ignore what's happening in South Africa. But what's really strange is how people are in South Africa, and unfortunately in America and some other places, are trying to deny the existence of the problem by saying it doesn't exist. But so the farm killings, you have the names of the people who have been murdered. I mean, I knew people who have been murdered on farms. And for someone to say, well, this problem doesn't exist, is really, really bizarre.
So let's talk about the details of that, because a few years ago, this started to pop up in the news. I remember we covered it on the show at the time. That's when you and I first got in contact, actually. And the take from the media is that, statistically speaking, it's not a big deal. People are being killed at kind of the normal rate that people are killed. There was a comparison between the rate of killing of farmers in rural South Africa to the rate of killing of people in Johannesburg, which is notorious for having significant violence problems. Talk a little bit about that. What's been happening with the killing of farmers?
Well, the counter-argument that you presented now is based on the idea that there are other problems as well, therefore you shouldn't talk about this problem. And the people who are saying this is a problem, we should do something about this, are not saying that there aren't other problems. And so one, just to point out the lunacy in this, is one way to respond to this is there's a big problem in South Africa with the poaching of rhinos. But no one is saying, why are you talking about rhino poaching? You are discriminating against elephants that are also being poached. The fact is that rhinos are poached in disproportionate numbers, and it has very particular consequences. And so to say that the farm murders have to stop is not to say that there isn't gang-related violence in Johannesburg or Cape Town. But as far as the murders are concerned, it started in 1990, and it gradually got worse. And and there's been some debate on how to calculate it. If you use the police statistics, I think the police data is quite accurate in terms of the murders, but not in terms of the attacks. The attacks are much more like this shadow number that you don't know of than what the police say. But according to police data, if you look at a period of 2 years, there were 2 farm attacks every day in South Africa, during which 2 people were murdered every week. It's been going on and on and on up, and it's a small community. The farming community there are about 30,000 commercial farmers in South Africa. So it's a small community, and if you're a farmer in South Africa, you know people who have been murdered. That's just the reality, or you have been attacked yourself. And I personally know people who've been attacked, people who've been killed, and so forth. So that's the one aspect, is just the rate at which it's happening. The second aspect is the brutality, and it's the worst tortures you can imagine. Really, I can't think of worse methods of torture than the ones that we've seen in South Africa, with gorging out of the eyes. We've had one farmer where I grew up, they had a shower nozzle turn up on the highest, warm water. They shoved the nozzle down his throat. And there are many, many, many such examples. I mean, I can go on. Every torture you can imagine has been applied during these.
And these are race-based murders?
So not all the victims are white. The victims are people of all races. I'm not aware of a black farmer that has been tortured. So it's a big phenomenon, and a lot is happening, and surely not all of them are politically motivated. Some of them certainly are, and we know that because sometimes the attackers write political slogans on the walls during these attacks. Or they would chant slogans, and then the survivors would come and say, the attackers said something like, "Die white man, Viva Malema," who's the politician who's chanting this, "Kill the Boer, kill the farmer." So some of them are obviously and overtly politically motivated, and some of them probably aren't, or some of them aren't. But we don't know those statistics in terms of the motivations. But it's very, very alarming.
So when it comes to the politics here, and the excuse that you hear in the world media is when you see videos of Malema saying "kill the Boer," number one, you'll hear, well, he doesn't actually mean it. It's just song. Who cares? Which is absurd on its face. But the other thing they'll say is, well, he's part of a party that isn't actually the governing party. ANC is the governing party, so why are we focusing so much on Malema, for example? Well, isn't ANC just fine?
Yeah, so he is, some people have called him the most influential, I think that's an exaggeration, but some have called him the most influential politician in Africa. He's certainly one of the most influential, and certainly in South Africa. His party has had some difficulty in the last election, but the thing is, ideologically, he's not far away from the EFF. In terms of rhetoric, he's much worse. He's not far away from the ruling party, from the ANC. In terms of rhetoric, it's worse. And so a few years ago, he made a speech where one of the statements he made during that speech was, we are going to slit the throat of whiteness. And then everyone was applauding. And then 2 days after, the president of South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa, publicly said, we invite this guy to come back and join our party, because we can see that deep down in his heart, he's still a member of the ANC. So we do find that the ruling party is a bit more subtle in its approach, although just as racist in terms of the policies that they are implementing. And then we have these parties to the left of them that are much more radical. But again, ideologically, there's not much of a difference. They both, the ruling party and the EFF, think of people like Robert Mugabe as a hero. Mao Zedong, they think is a hero. Joseph Stalin, even Maduro. They go all these Fidel Castro, all these communist examples, and then they would not only say that these people are heroes, they would say we need to duplicate their policies. We need to bring their policies, but in South Africa it's going to work. In as far as they would be willing to concede that it hasn't worked, they would say this time it's going to work.
Well, one of the things that is fascinating about what's happening and horrifying is the connection of a sort of communist philosophy of economics with a Frantz Fanon, decolonization, violence is the solution, and transforms people spiritually attitude that seems to have crept in South Africa and is part of a sort of third worldism that now spans not just South Africa, but wide parts of the Middle East, enormous parts of Asia. And it's part of a broader movement that we're seeing globally that basically suggests that anyone who is failing is a victim of capitalist excesses predominantly by white people, and that all of that has to be overthrown.
Yes. So Frantz Fanon has become more and more popular in South Africa, and it seems like in other places of the world. And his philosophy could be summarized in The Wretched of the Earth. He says that, more or less, that if someone treats you like an animal, you don't need to behave like a human being towards that person. So it's, in a way, a justification of violence. And now the Marxist line on that is, if you are poor, it is because someone stole something from you. And if you are wealthy or successful, it is because you exploited someone or you stole from someone. So being poor by definition means that you are a victim, and being wealthy by definition means you're a perpetrator. But then they blend that with race nationalism, saying that only black people are poor, and only white people are rich, or that's the only ones we care about. We only want to talk about wealthy white people and poor black people, when reality is much different than that, of course. And so then they blend these two by saying that the poor and the black South Africans are the same thing, and whites and wealthy South Africans are the same thing, when that's not true. And then they say, and that's because they stole from us, and so we need to take their stuff. And then we have our own blend of philosophy in South Africa called the Zania critical theory. Zania is sort of the leftist name for South Africa, which is taking some stuff from Frantz Fanon, taking some stuff from philosophers, critical race theory in America, Robin DiAngelo, people like that, and then in a way justifying, that we should apply violence. And if you apply violence, it's actually morally it's appropriate to apply violence to the white minority.
And you can see this manifesting domestically. You can also see it in terms of the foreign policy of South Africa. South Africa famously sponsored this ridiculous International Court of Justice assault on the Israeli government, suggesting that Israel was committing a genocide in Gaza. And there are deep connections between Hamas and the South African government, between Iran and the South African government. There's presumably money that's changing hands along those lines as well.
Yes. So looking from a South African perspective at that court case, it was really bizarre to watch the arguments, because they used the same legal team as was used in South Africa to defend the kill the Boer, kill the farmer chant. So they would say in South Africa that chanting about murdering people based on their ethnicity is not hate speech. And then they would say it's not, because you have to look at the context. So don't look at the words, look at the context. And the context is, of course, apartheid. So because there was apartheid, we can now talk about killing people in South Africa. And then the same legal team, the same lawyer argued in the case against Israel that do not look at the context. So ignore October 7, that the context is irrelevant, and only look at this particular statement that was made by this particular soldier or something like that. And so it's really bizarre. And so the argument was that we need to do this because we have a strong moral conviction and we have a strong sense of morality. And it's in the consistent application of our idea of morality that we have to take Israel to court. When if you really look what that sense of morality is, and you compare and you look at the application there of how some of the world's worst dictators, historically, they regard as heroes. Currently, they would defend them. They would not arrest them when they come to South Africa, even though the International Criminal Court have sanctions on them and so forth. So it's really bizarre, but they seem to get away with that because there is this movement in the world that is so hell-bent either on participating in these type of activities or defending it and pretending that, it's okay because morally it's appropriate to be on this side of the argument.
So what are the answers in South Africa? Obviously, the Trump administration is now applying sanctions to talking about applying sanctions to South Africa based on the racial discrimination in the law, based on their threats to expropriate property from essentially white people. What would the actual solutions be domestically? What would a better governed South Africa look like?
Yeah, that's the important question. So one way to answer it is in your book, Easy Steps to Destroy America. It's in a sense the answer. You said that America, there's a sense of unity in America because of a shared philosophy, a shared culture, and a shared history. The problem in South Africa is that we don't have any of those. So we have the proper way to think of South Africa is a region. So East Africa is a series of countries. North Africa is a list of countries. West Africa is a list of countries. South Africa is one country. But in South Africa, there are many nations living in South Africa. And within these nations, they have shared philosophy, shared culture, shared history. But as a whole, we don't have that. And the problem is if you govern, it's pretty much the equivalent of the European Union as the government of Europe. If you approach things like that, necessarily it would lead to conflict and friction. And so the only long-term solution is to work towards a more sustainable political dispensation or political system.
A federalism.
Yeah, exactly. Federalism, a decentralized system that's based on the idea of self-governance, that local communities or cultural communities, or however you want to frame it, can have a degree of self-governance. Because currently we have this very big country. The distance from the north to the south is the distance from Rome to London. And it's just as diverse, perhaps even more diverse than Western Europe. It is more diverse than Western Europe. And so we have this central government trying to enforce its ideas, a government that says our philosophy or ideology is a blend of race, nationalism, and socialism, as if that's never been tried before. And so it's just not going to work. It's going to lead to more and more friction. So we need to move towards either federalism or some form of decentralization. And that could take many forms.
I mean, the fact that that's even remotely controversial is sort of beyond me, because that is the way that it has historically worked. It worked that way in the United States originally, where even the states, members of states had their own identities, and that's why we had a very weak central government, and that's why Virginia was governed different than Massachusetts, which was governed different from New Hampshire. And the same thing is obviously true in Europe. I mean, much of the angst about the EC and then the EU has been specifically about the idea that a French identity is different from a British identity. And when you have people who don't share a philosophy or a history or a culture or an ideology or anything like that, what you end up with is one group having to dominate another group. And in one form that can take is apartheid, and a reverse form of that can be a racist regime that cracks down on white people.
Yes.
And so the idea that, and what you're talking about here is not racial identitarianism. What you're talking about here is cultural affinity. And the fact that you have cultural affinities between people, that of course is totally real and inarguable. You're not suggesting that white is better than black is better than white can't live with white. What you're saying is that there are cultures that are different. Those cultures should be able to self-govern. And the idea that those cultures have to be put into a system that is ruled top-down in tyrannical fashion by either one group grabbing the gun or the other group grabbing the gun is unworkable.
Yes, so if democracy means two wolves and a lamb have to vote on what's for dinner, you shouldn't blame the lamb for losing faith in democracy. But the good news is that's not democracy. That's not what democracy is supposed to be. Democracy is about self-governance. And unfortunately, we have this tyranny of the majority that many Americans have warned about over the centuries, where some ideas are just enforced. And so let me give you a quick example. We have the name changes in South Africa. That's going to make the country better. Just change all the offensive names, which actually started there, and now it's sort of spilled over to America as well. And so they changed. There would be street names and city names named after murderers, people who had just murdered innocent people. And if you ask the ruling party, how do you determine if something is offensive or not? Like Church Street is offensive, but the name of a murderer is not offensive, then they would say, we are the people, we represent the people, and therefore we decide. And so it's just not going to work. And I think the answer is to go to the Jefferson line of eternal solutions. We're not trying to figure out some new ideological solution that no one has ever thought of. It's been a principle since the beginning, since Rome and Athens and Jerusalem, the idea that there must be some form of self-governance. People should be able to govern themselves, and with that in mind, you should have mutual relations with other communities. And yes, it is very politically incorrect to talk about that, but we need to break that wall, because that's the only way forward. That's the only solution for South Africa.
Right. I mean, again, I think that one of the things that people are trying to tie this into is sort of white nationalism or white supremacy, and that's a category error. That's not actually what you're talking about here.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And so they try to blend it with all these sort of these slogans that have been devised to sort of just swipe something off the table. I think there was a saying, one of the big Afrikaner entrepreneurs of the previous century, Anton Rupert, who was world famous in his days, said that you can't go to bed and rest assured at night if your neighbor is hungry. And so that's an important thing for us as the Afrikaner community. We don't want to find a solution for us at the expense of everyone else, because that's not a solution either. The solution must be a solution for everyone. And I think what we have currently is a problem for everyone. There are very few people who would still say that South Africa is working. They would concede that it's failing. The debate is it a failed state or a failing state? But then they would sort of defend the government still. And so it's not working for anyone. And so we need to find a solution that would work for people. And the idea that bringing the government closer to the people is an eternal solution. It's something that has been the idea since the Roman Republic and before that.
It's basic Montesquieu, right? I mean, there's nothing new here. I mean, this is what all the American founders talked about, the idea of your local government is going to be the government that is best for you, that you do have to have decentralization, that you do have to have local rule, that most of the things you agree on with your neighbors are going to be things that you agree on with your actual neighbors, not people who live thousands of miles away and share a completely different culture and affinity for different philosophy. Again, the fact that this has become controversial is because we live in a sort of bizarre world where you have to force yourself into these false choices again, that it's either apartheid or it's racial rule by the ANC, and there's no in between. There's nothing else that can be done here, and that obviously is untrue. So is there any level of support inside South Africa for this sort of decentralization? How does that level of support go?
It's growing. It's fast growing. So firstly, it's not that controversial anymore to say, look, guys, this isn't working. Again, you would have people in the media defending it. There was a piece just published today in South Africa, how expropriation of property would rejuvenate the economy. So you get that, you still get that, but the idea that it's not working is widely accepted. I think the idea that we need to bring government closer to the people is also widely accepted. People agree with that. So there's talk about Cape secession, sort of the Western province. There's really a movement there saying we need to break away from South Africa. The Zulus in KwaZulu-Natal are concerned that the central government isn't representing them. There's a project called Boermedia in the Northern Cape to develop an Afrikaner city. So there are already many such projects, and I think that's naturally where things are headed. There's going to be some form of a crash, you might say, or something's going to happen in South Africa, and we must just ensure that when something happens, it's a turn to a better system rather than...
It's not chaotic violence and warfare in the streets or anything like that.
Yes.
I mean, I think there's also a great example of how paper guarantees mean nothing if you don't have some level of cultural affinity and unity among the population. When the South African Constitution was written, Ruth Bader Ginsburg famously suggested it was a better constitution than the Constitution of the United States because it guaranteed things like a right to health care and a right to housing. And
a right to a good environment.
Exactly. It's like a list of these rights that aren't actually rights. They're things that have to be provided to you by others. Yeah. And it's not like a right to free speech, where essentially a right to free speech means you have a duty not to infringe on my free speech. A right to housing means you have a duty to provide me housing. And it turns out that none of that materialized. There's a lack of housing. It turns out that the duty the right to healthcare doesn't mean that healthcare in South Africa magically materializes in amazing ways where the healthcare is just tremendous. All these sorts of paper ideas that were put forward at the expense of realism in the 1990s, in places like South Africa, have completely fallen.
Exactly. And you've spoken about this a lot. It's one thing to talk about rights, and rights are great. But if there's no focus on responsibility added to that, then the rights don't mean anything. So almost all of these rights, in terms of the difference between de jure and de facto, the de facto reality has gotten worse. Constitution guarantees the right to health care, but in reality, the health system is deteriorating. The Constitution guarantees good education, but in reality, the schools are failing. And we can go down the list. And so this idea that if you have something good written as a document, that means, the country has been saved is very naive. And I think maybe it's one of the consequences of modern ideologies that, you look at the text and that sort of gives you an overview of what's happening. But you have to look at what's happening in reality and compare those two. And the reality between the written document and what we call the actual constitution and the written constitution has gone like this. It's not comparable anymore. And so the question is then, it's a great document, but what does it mean to have a great document if that's just not reality? And I think there's an important lesson in that also, that, and this is something that Edmund Burke cautioned against with the French Revolution, saying it's one thing to have great theory, but you need to look at experience and what's happening in the real world before you look at the theory.
Yeah, for sure. And one of the things Burke warned about was the idea that these sort of free-floating rights were equally applicable at all times in all places without any roots in the actual soil of a culture. I mean, the idea of Western-based rights are based in a particular ideology of the West that is an outgrowth of thousands of years of history. And the idea that they sort of magically manifest anywhere you drop them is obviously untrue. You have to put in place institutions, you have to develop cultures around them. And if those things don't happen, then they don't mean anything. It's just a paper right. Yeah. So you're looking at what the Trump administration is doing. Obviously, the State Department is now sounding off pretty openly about this under Secretary Rubio. What would you like to see the Trump administration do?
Thank you. Well, So we are very grateful for the focus they're putting on what's happening in South Africa. They have announced a process of refugee status to farmers. Now that in a certain sense is good because there are people who want to leave. But I think our message to them is a lot of people, and the majority, wouldn't want to leave. It's almost like saying to Americans, listen, there's trouble in America, you need to all move to Europe or something like that. So, I mean, we've been there for hundreds of years. That's where our culture was developed. That's where our ancestors are buried. And so we are very attached to Africa. And we are concerned that if we just leave in big numbers, then we will dissolve as a community. And we want to see a future for our community. But there are people who want to leave. And if they want to leave, that's fine. But I think a more sustainable approach would be to work towards some form of dispensational change, recognizing firstly that it's not working, that the problem is wider than just not that the wrong person is the president of the country. If you put make a white liberal the president of South Africa, it's not going to work either. and because it's a system problem, and we need to work towards a better system. And we don't want other countries to solve our problems on our behalf. But I think firstly a recognition that there needs to be a more decentralized solution, and then secondly support initiatives in South Africa to try to promote this. I think that would be good.
And so for a normal American who's watching this, and I think that we've talked about this, that the fact that what's happening in South Africa is a bleeding edge indicator of sort of trends that are growing across the world, also in the West. I mean, this is an internal battle in the West that is happening right now about what exactly the West means. What are the West's values? Do the West values require that you essentially sacrifice all the values of the West on behalf of empty rhetoric about rights or about constitutional guarantees or about that sort of stuff? Like, what does it mean to be a member of a culture? What does it mean to be a member of the West? What do you recommend that, resources for Americans who want to learn more about this, and also if Americans want to help, because this actually does have ramifications far beyond what's going on just in South Africa?
Yeah, there are many ways in which people can help. One way is just to help to talk about this. The more people talk about this, the better. The easier it is to make solutions, the easier it is, for example, for the government to do something or people in Europe to support. So help spread the message. That's one way. But another way is there are many institutions in South Africa. If people spend a little time looking into what's happening in South Africa, they will find that there are a lot of institutions who are working towards some form of decentralization or working towards community organizing, towards safety initiatives, towards things like that. And I think support for such institutions will definitely go a long way.
Well, Dr. Ernst Roets, really appreciate you being here, and thanks for what you're doing.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me on the show.
All right, you guys, coming up, Representative Jasmine